YouTube, Noah, everyone who reads and must converse. Thanks for coming back by the channel. Yasmin to the Lit House. How you
Okay.
doing, Yasmin?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Great, for sure. Borges or Sundays with Borges
Yes.
is back in action. Happy Sunday,
Mm-hmm.
y'all. So, what a no better way to spend your Sunday evening than exploring
Right?
a Borges short
That's what I
story.
think.
For sure. And then tonight, we definitely have a killer one for you. The Other Death is what it's called. You want to say something before we just jump into it, Yasmin, or are we just gonna
Let's just jump in.
let's tear it open? All right. So this story starts off with Borges is the main character, kind of the one telling the story, sure, just like
Mm-hmm.
most of his stuff. So
Yeah.
Borges hears of the death of Pedro Damian. Now, this comes as kind of like a side to a letter that he receives from a friend of his named Gannon. So,
Mm-hmm.
Gannon writes him a letter talking about he's going to translate a Ralph Waldo Emerson poem called The Past. And in that, he says, oh, by the way, Pedro Damian died the other day from a pulmonary distress. It was a lung degenerative disease or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Borges kind of recalls who this person is, met him only once in his life, but had heard about had heard his story, and he has an
Mm-hmm.
idea of who he is. And there's two things just on this first page that I wanted to point out. And do you know that Borges was a very big fan of William Faulkner?
No, but I can see that. I
he
didn't know that.
translated he translated a William Faulkner short story. I forget the name of it. It just kind of came up when I was looking at this, because when I came across this line, I was thinking, is there something here? Check this out. The sound and the fury of Mausolere were the full extent of his story. It came as no surprise to me that he had relived those times as he lay dying.
Okay. See, I absolutely missed that because I'm used to hearing the names as I lay dying and the Son of the Fury in English.
Right.
So when I read it in Spanish, it just wasn't the same.
So,
But
and I mean,
you're
this is
absolutely
translation.
right.
How weird is that? That
Mm-hmm.
in that one line, we have two William Faulkner titles that were both published before this short story was. This short story collection, The Aleph, was published in 1949,
Mm-hmm.
and Sound in the Fury is 1927, and As I Lay Dying is 1930.
Nice.
So I just thought, I'm like, is he paying homage
Just
to William
yeah,
Faulkner? It was
that is
it was
so
just
amazing.
it was cool. But what that is saying there is that on his deathbed, Pedro Damian actually relived a battle that he was in. He was part of like a militia army, um, gauchos, just a not a very organized army, not part
Mm-hmm.
of the country, but they were fighting for revolution or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And in this battle, they were outnumbered. They were up against a serious
Mm-hmm.
army. And this guy, Pedro Damian, turns tail and runs, and he deserts his post, and he just goes back to his farm and lives
Mm-hmm.
his life out there. So on
Yeah.
his deathbed, he relives this battle. And
Mm-hmm.
Borges says, well, it doesn't surprise me that he would relive that battle. That's obviously the most powerful thing that he went through in his life or
Exactly.
something like that.
Yeah.
So he died
Exactly.
recalling that battle in which he deserted his army. And then at the end of that paragraph it says, Gannon sent me a photo of him, but I've lost it. And now I've stopped looking for it. I'd be afraid to find it
Very
at this point.
ominous.
Yeah, we got the typical Borges ominous, like, well,
Yeah.
why would he be afraid to find this letter and afraid to find this picture now of this guy?
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I just
go ahead.
wanted to say really quickly that it's a very similar opening to the story that we talked about last Sunday, Emma Soon's. So it starts out with a letter talking about the death of a person, and there were a lot of ominous statements and also a lot like a big mystery surrounding what the narrator was up to or the main character was up to.
Right. Yeah. What is
Yeah,
he
I
getting
hadn't
at?
noticed that, but because we just talked about it.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So the narrator Borges, typically has an idea for a short story, right? Which may or may not be this story that we're reading, but he
Mm-hmm.
has an idea for a story. He says a fantasy story, and he's doing research for that. So he meets up with a colonel that was in the militia army that Pedro Damian deserted.
Mm-hmm.
The battle that's in question is that battle Masolier, something like that. That is, I guess, a place
Yeah.
where the battle took place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they talk and they talk about that battle, and the the colonel says it was in another voice, or Borges is saying this. It's not quoted. The colonel. It was in another voice that he, the colonel, said that war, like women, served to test a man. But before a man goes into battle, no man knows who he truly is. It might be one fellow might think himself a coward and turn out to be a brave man, or the
Mm-hmm.
other way around, which it was, which was what happened to the poor Damien, who swaggered around the Pulperius with his white ribbon and then fell apart at Mausoleum. So he had this swagger. He was happy to be to be in the army and to prove himself and all this. And when the rubber hits the road, it's not his thing.
Yeah.
He just left. And the colonel says that this colonel recalls Pedro Damian as being that person
Howard.
by name.
Exactly. I really like that paragraph. How you really never know how you're gonna act until you really get to that situation, and that makes up your identity in some way, and how you perceive yourself and how other people perceive you.
Right. It's a very
Yeah.
perceptive thing, and I love that kind of thing
Mm-hmm.
too, because I think it's so much. People say, "Oh, I'd never do this," or "I'd never do that. I'd never kill somebody.
Right. Exactly.
I'd never cheat on my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never do this or that." Right? But
Yeah.
until you are in the situation and you are faced with that decision, you don't know what you would say. You don't
Exactly.
know what you will do. Period. Because all the thinking that you want to do is not the activity. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
action. Um,
Yeah. And what you actually do is dependent upon so many different components that there's no way you can ever um, take into account when you're just coming up to coming up with what you think you'll do.
right.
Like it's
In
just
some
absolutely
hypothetical
unpredictable. There's so
situation.
many variables. Exactly.
Right. It,
And
in a hypothetical, you wouldn't ever be able to come up with how many variables would be at
exactly.
play in the actual situation.
It's impossible to know.
Right.
And can I also point out something that's written before that, where the narrator or Borges is talking about how he's not sure whether to fully believe what the colonel is saying because it sounded almost like he had repeated it so many times
Right.
that it was also almost this like narrative that he had already formed in his mind, and it
Right.
might not be the full truth. And that is very true. Like we sometimes just tell stories over and over and over, and we might change little facts and little details, but then that becomes the story that we believe to be the truth.
Right.
And
He
that's
talked
what we
about
tell other
these.
people.
Yeah. He talked about these battles and did so with such perfectly formed periods and so vividly that I realized that he told these same stories many times before.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, it all made me fear that behind his words hardly any memories remained. And so it is an exploration of memory,
Mm-hmm.
this story.
Oh
I
yeah,
think that's
absolutely.
something to keep in mind the whole way through is memory and what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Because our narrator has already recalled quite a few things that he remembers,
Yeah.
and and we're just keeping on with that track. So
Mm-hmm.
he goes through and he says that he's embarrassed by
Mm-hmm.
hearing about this about Pedro Damian deserting his army and how he acted because it's cowardly. He acted as a coward and whatever, and so he was embarrassed for him, but he says, well, these fearful people, cowardice is actually more complex of a situation than bravery.
Mhm.
So it might serve to make his story even more interesting, this story that he
Mhm.
wants to write. But things are not really gelling with his story. It's not really taking shape. So a little while longer, maybe a few weeks, maybe a month, maybe a little more, he goes back to talk to the colonel again. And the
Mhm.
colonel is sitting there with a friend of his. The
Yeah.
friend is Amaro, right? And who
Mhm.
is also a distinguished gentleman of the military that was in the same battle, and they are hanging out. And he goes and talks to him, and Amaro says, I know. I know the Argentine kid that fell apart under fire. Or no, that's Borges. The narrator says, I know.
Yeah.
When Amaro says the name Pedro Damian,
Mhm.
Borges says, I know the Argentine kid that fell apart under fire. I stopped, and the two men were looking at me perplexedly. I beg your pardon, sir, Amaro said at last. Pedro Damian died as any man might wish to die. It was about 4 in the afternoon. The Red Infantry had dug in on the peak on the hill. Our men charged them with lances. Damian led the charge, yelling, and a bullet got him straight in the chest. He stopped, stock still, finished his yell and crumpled, and his body was trampled under the hooves of the horses. He was dead, and the final charge at Mausolea rolled right over him. Such a brave man and not yet 20. So,
The complete opposite account of what
wait,
we had just heard.
so what? So what? And he says right then, undoubtedly they're talking about another Damien, and he goes to
Mhm.
try to figure this out. And as much as he tries to uh, say what the details about the Pedro Damien that he's talking about, they verify that. They're
Mhm.
verifying that this is, yes, that's
Yeah,
the
that's
one. That's
exactly
who
who
we're
we're
talking
talking
about.
about.
And it's
Mhm.
just like, wait, what is happening right now? And so he goes on a search, and now we get like the kind of detective research where he's trying to find pictures of Damien. He's trying to find out where he's buried,
Mhm.
when he has died. And now the year that this is in that he has died is um 1942, am I right? But the battle
Good.
is in 1904. So
Um,
do I have
19.
1946? Sorry. So in 1946, that's when the old Damien the Coward dies at his farm. And this battle took place in 1904. So there's
Mhm. Yeah.
42 years in between that. Damien died an older man, at least 60, mid 60s, something like
Mhm.
that. But the Damien that died on the battlefield is, about 20,
Yeah.
20 years old. And so he goes to search for the old Damien that died from pulmonary distress, and he can't find him. And he can't find his letter, and he can't find the picture of Damien. And it's almost like, is he misremembering? There is
Yeah.
a there is a part of this where he then goes to Gannon, who is his friend that wrote the letter that told him about it at the beginning. And I reminded him that he had promised me the translation of Emerson in the same letter in which he had written me the news of Damien's death. He asked, who is this Damien that you're speaking about? I told him, but it drew no response. With the beginnings of a sense of terror, I saw that he was looking at me strangely, so I bluffed my way into a literary argument about the sort of person who'd criticize Emerson,
Mhm.
and they move on. But um, somebody who is not invested in this, his friend Gannon, his memory has
Is fading when it comes
changed.
to Pedro Damian. And this is when it starts to get very weird.
Very.
But what I wanted to say was I quickly read the poem before this, and the past is essentially about how the past is unchangeable. Once the past happens, when something happens, there's nothing that you can do about it. And I think that it's, very significant that towards the beginning of the story, we have the usual idea that we can't change the past. When something happens, there's nothing we can do. And this friend was willing to provide a translation of the past. So stating that the past was unchangeable. And then now when people's memories start to fade and they start to misremember or not remember this man at all, that's when the Borges' friend tells him, no, I don't want to provide a translation for this text that states that you can't change the past.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, I mean, and the very next thing after that, though, is now it's not that memories are fading. It's that they're actively like changing. Like the Colonel sends him a letter, in which now he is no longer confused
Right. So
about who Damien is.
at first he remembers him as a coward, and then his memory it's almost as if that memory were erased, and then it
Right.
comes back as a different memory.
Yeah, but his friend in that intermediary period remembers him as the heroic one in that
Right.
second
Yeah,
session.
it's different for different people, I guess. I
Yeah,
don't know what the
and
criteria is.
I think it might be like, how invested or how much the individual might know about
Right. Yeah,
the
I agree.
situation or the person in question.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very strange.
It
So
is.
now I pass to hypotheses. He says, the simplest yet the least satisfactory posits two Damiens. The coward who died in 1946, and the brave man who died in the battle at Mausilier in 1904. The problem with that hypothesis is that it doesn't explain the truly enigmatic
Mm-hmm.
part of it all. The curious comings and goings of the Colonel's memory, the forgetfulness that wipes out the image and even the name of the man who was remembered such a short time ago. And he also says there, I do not and I cannot accept an even simpler hypothesis that I might have dreamed the first remembering. So
Mm-hmm.
he's reinforcing that he's not misremembering. He's writing this down. This is a literary undertaking for him, and he is trying to get his facts straight,
Yeah.
and weird things are happening.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Now, what I love is how he puts this kind of thing, and I'm gonna go ahead and read it because I couldn't do it any better just talking about
Go
what
ahead.
Borges is getting at. Damien behaved. This is the way that I imagine it. I imagine it. I as Borges. Damien behaved like a coward on the field at Mausilier, and he dedicated his life to correcting that shameful moment of weakness. He returned to Entre Rios. He raised his hand against no man, and he marked no one. He sought no reputation for bravery, but in the fields, dealing with the bushy wilderness and the skittish livestock, he hardened himself. Little by little, he was preparing himself unwittingly for the miracle. Deep inside himself, he thought, if fate brings me another battle, I will know how to deserve it. For 40 years, he waited for that battle with vague hopefulness, and fate at last brought it to him at the hour of his death. It brought in it the form of a delirium, but long ago the Greeks knew that we are shadows of a dream. And in his dying agony, he relived his battle, and he acquitted himself like a man. He led the final charge and took a bullet in the chest. Thus, in 1946, by the grace of his long-held passion, Pedro Damian died in the defeat at Mausilier, which took place between the winter and spring of the year 1904. How awesome.
That is so cool.
That in 1946, he died in 1904.
Exactly. It's insane.
So,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, that it's this death or this moment that he can't stand, and he spends his whole life trying to change that. Um, and I guess that there are two stories that we've talked about in other videos that come to mind, or that came to mind when I reread this today. The first one is the South. Um, the South is, at least one interpretation of the South is that the main character has um, an injury, has an accident, and he goes to the hospital
Right.
and dies in the hospital. But minutes before dying, he imagines alternate way, um, this alternate way in which he died. So he
Right.
imagines himself going to the South where he owns property and then running into someone at a bar and then having a knife fight and dying, essentially a very brave person.
Right.
And in this one, Damien, he imagines his death in those last minutes of his life as well. But what's crazy about this one is that, unlike the South, those that new version of events is sort of seeping into reality. And
Right.
that part of the story reminds me a lot of Lawn, and how we get this I guess, other perception of the world or other version, and those elements start to seep into reality, and we get these glitches almost, or elements that don't really make sense in our world and can't really be explained. And I guess that's what he gets into in the next paragraph. But those
Right.
are the
Well,
main
and
things that I thought of.
yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think you're exactly spot on, especially with the South there, because it's this kind of we get it as an external story, an external happening for this guy, but it's
Hmm.
actually all the internal thought processes
Yeah.
and imaginings. And in this
Hmm.
one, we're getting a more of that. The imaginings and the internal thought processes are actually changing the outer world. And
Hmm.
so I saw this. There is a lot that comes up here that is more that touches on theology, what God can or can't do. And since
Yeah.
that came up, I saw an analog or a parallel to the secret miracle, because the secret
Oh
miracle
yeah.
definitely is one of the only ones where he calls out God as
And
as
God
as
grants
as
him
an
a
entity,
wish. Yeah.
right? But with this, I saw it as like the first Mandela effect that
Hmm.
ever, and we have a term for this now, but Borges didn't know, there was no Mandela effect at that point. But this is what has happened. So what he says is, to change the past is not to change a mere single event. It is to annul all of its consequences, which tend to infinity. In other words, it's to create two histories of the world. In what we might call the first, Pedro Damian died in 1946. In the second, he died at Mazalier in 1904. The latter history is the one that we're living in now.
Hmm.
So the revised, the second history. And what is it revised by? It's revised by his delirium on his deathbed. It is totally amazing. But
Yeah.
since Borges had no idea about Mandela effect, and this is obviously something different than that. I mean, there's not a name for it. So uh, I was thinking, well, where did Borges get the idea for doing this? Right? Is there something that we can point to, or that maybe comes from some of Borges' other stuff, right? And Borges calls out Kabbalah.
Hmm.
He's called it out in fictions a lot more than in the Aleph in these short stories for sure. But as a younger writer, he was more apt to put that stuff in his writings, the Sefer Yetzirah, Jewish Kabbalah, and therefore Hermeticism. But he doesn't call out Hermeticism by name so much, but Kabbalah. There
Hmm.
is a practice in Kabbalah, in the practical workings out of that kind of path work, called revision, where what you do is you take a scene, which may be something that you don't like. Say you
Hmm.
argue with your boss all the
Yeah.
time. Instead of, as you're laying down at night or while you're making dinner or something, you're replaying an argument that you've had, or you're anticipating and worrying about a future argument and that kind of thing. Instead of that, what you do is you enact a scene, come up imaginative, consciously exploring a scene where it is what you want it to be. So he would be, your boss might be praising you for something. If it's somebody who's always critical, or your boss is always, you know, being critical of you or something, then it would be the opposite of that. It would be praising and you saying, thank you, you know, I tried really hard. And him saying, oh, well, you know, I really see that you've really put in a lot of effort here, you know. You're you know, and you enact a whole conversation and you feel everything that you
like
would feel,
visualizing what you want it to be, or the
and what you
ideal
would
thing.
feel like shake hands and really imaginatively, like, give it all sensory perception, give it all that. You have to be totally invested. It's called creative visualization. Sometimes there's a lot of names for it, but it is essentially bringing sensation and feeling into a daydream or an imaginative exercise. And so revision is something, and I can't help to think that Borges did come in contact with that, as interested as he is in Kabbalah. So it's just something that is super interesting. That did he think, and when we were talking about it on Boxer, you said it's so hard to locate what Borges really thinks and what he's exploring. Like, where's
he
that
explores
line?
so much. Yeah, no, we always have this conversation when it comes to we talk about Borges's beliefs and all of that. And the reason I think it's really hard is because he just explores so much, and he seemed to be the type of person who just took pleasure in exploring beliefs and ideas, even if he didn't necessarily subscribe to them. And sometimes he touches on things that contradict each other. So I think that it's difficult to really know what he was thinking. But in this story, I can absolutely see that sort of imagining an event and making it as real as possible in your mind. And
if the guy's under a delirium, then he's totally, that's his world. You know? So he is completely doing it, and he's doing it very hardcore.
He's the
The
first
whole
one to
heart is in
change.
it. Right.
And then that changes the external world and
the
people around him. But something that I wanted to say as you were talking, I remembered the Garden of Forking Paths and how this is different to that. So in the Garden of Forking Paths, you'd get two different events that sort of split two paths almost. And in one of them, Pedro Damian would die, and the other die a hero, and in the other one, he would be a coward and run away. But in this case, it's an event changing, and then the repercussions and the consequences of that. And I think it's really well explored. Like you said, the Mandela Effect and all of that. There would be glitches, and like, for example,
residuals.
This person, exactly, like this person misremembering, and then or remembering and then forgetting and then remembering differently. But what I think is really interesting is how the narrator, we don't really know how unreliable the narrator is. You mentioned how he was writing everything down. He relied on what he had heard and all of that. But at the beginning of the story, he says, this friend of mine wrote me a letter saying that he would translate The Past by Emerson, and he also told me about Pedro Damian's death. But he says at the beginning, in that first line, that he lost that letter.
And he lost it.
Exactly. And then towards the end, and then towards the end of that paragraph, he says, my memory is hazy, but this is what I remember. And then he mentions this picture that you talked about that he lost. So every single piece of, and then this coronel that he's talking to, he lost his memory as to that first conversation. So everything that he brings up, it's almost like he has no evidence to back that up. And we have to fully trust his version of things. So that's also really interesting. And it makes you wonder, like, who do we believe? Because if it had been a different narrator, we would have gotten a completely different story.
Yeah. And that's why I say, like, with this also, this might be the fantasy that he was talking about writing. You know what I mean? And this is just
Exactly, yeah.
Borges is so good at creating these characters, and then they do the literary criticism for him. They do all his, his grunt work, and he's just sitting back there having fun, blowing our minds.
That is absolutely true.
Very cool. The Other Death. It's a mind blow. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Are you cool, Yasmin? You want to say some more?
No, I'm good.
All right. Thank you, BookTube. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Catch you next Sunday. Bye-bye.